are 8 cervical nerves. Welcome back to Understanding Human Anatomy, Spinal Cord, Part 2. Last time we looked at a cross-section of the spinal cord and we described the gray matter on the inside in the butterfly shape and white matter on the outside surrounding the gray matter. I want to give you a couple of other references, landmarks, to help you orient yourself. The first is the anterior median fissure. And the anterior median fissure is this space I've drawn in on the anterior side of the spinal cord. There actually is a gap between the left and right sides. That's the anterior median fissure. Now this is important because that helps you orient to anterior. This is the anterior or ventral side of the cord. There's another structure or landmark posteriorly, the posterior median septum. And the posterior median septum is indicated by this line running from the posterior surface down to the beginning of the gray matter. These two landmarks will help you separate anterior from posterior and allow you to orient yourself when you see a diagram or a slide of a cross-section of the spinal cord without other references. Now, the gray matter can be divided into 3 horns, gray horns. The first of these is the posterior gray horn, or simply posterior horn. Now the posterior horn receives sensory information. In anatomy, another way of saying sensory is saying afferent. The posterior gray horn is concerned with sensory information. Much of the sensory information that is brought into the spinal cord via the spinal nerves will be directed into the posterior horn and synapse upon other neurons in the posterior horn. Remember, gray matter means neurons, nerve cell bodies. And then these neurons will relay the information up to higher centers. In other words, up to the brain. There is in much of the cord, not all of the cord, but much of the cord, a lateral horn. And the lateral horn is motor, but it's visceral. visceral motor. And again, motor is, in another term used for motor is efferent. So the lateral horn is involved with visceral efferent. Now, the part of the nervous system that controls our internal organs, our viscera, is the autonomic nervous system. So the lateral horn contains motor neurons of the autonomic nervous system. And we'll draw a line into the lateral horn here. The third horn is the anterior horn. And the anterior horn is also motor, but it is somatic. Somatic motor, or somatic efferent. These are the neurons that control our skeletal muscles. The axons from the neurons you find in the anterior horn pass out to our skeletal muscles and stimulate them to contract, to activate. The white column, the white matter, is divided into 3 columns. The first that we'll talk about is the posterior column. And again, we could always put the color in, posterior white column. The posterior column. And the posterior column is this area running between the anterior horn and the posterior median septum. The posterior column is carrying sensory information up to the brain. Now, the remainder are the lateral and anterior columns, and they kind of merge together. See, there's no real sharp landmark separating the anterior and the lateral white columns. But we can show where they are in general, well away from the boundary. The lateral column is that part that is lateral to the gray matter, right here, and it contains bundles of axons that are both bringing sensory information up to the brain, which would be ascending tracts, and tracts bringing information down from the brain to the spinal cord, descending tracts. So while the posterior column is almost all ascending, The lateral column is both ascending and descending. The anterior white column, or anterior column, is in this position, and the dividing line is somewhere, kind of where I'm indicating with the cursor. But again, there's no sharp dividing line. The anterior column also is both ascending and descending. In other words, there are ascending tracts and descending tracts. Axons going from the brain to the spinal cord and from the spinal cord to the brain. So we have posterior horn, which is strictly sensory, lateral horn, which is visceral motor, visceral efferent, anterior horn, which is somatic motor or somatic efferent, and then we have the posterior, lateral, and anterior columns, which are composed of bundles of axons traveling through the central nervous system. In the next session, we'll talk about how the spinal nerves form and the structures associated with the spinal nerve, and we'll also do some more anatomy of the spinal cord. Thank you for your attention.